Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Pulumi for IT Pros. This week, we're going to have a look at resource options. And this is a feature that allows us to customize how our resources are deployed and configured. And we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into the options that are available to us with that setting. So, resource options, or custom resource options, as they might be referred to in some languages, are used as part of our resource creation to allow us to specify some additional properties on the resource. And they're available on any of the Pulumi resources. And we're actually already using them. So if you remember from a previous video, we've got this resource options item here. So this just basically allows us to provide on any object, there will be this options piece. And we can create a new Pulumi.resource options property, and we can set some things in here. We're already using it from a previous video. If you remember when we had issues with that date created tag being causing the resource to be updated every time, we use the ignore changes option. We also use the protection option, but we'll go through each of these in a bit more detail. But there's a whole load of other options as well that we can look at. So let's start and run through those. The first one is ignore changes, as mentioned. So this allows us to ignore when something changes on an object when we come to use Pulumi up to deploy it, and it detects that something has changed, particularly if you use the refresh piece. This is really useful if you've got things that are either changing outside of your control or that are being triggered by something you don't actually want to cause a change. So in the example we had here, we've got that date created one, which we only want to be set at initial deploy time. And then after that, we are going to ignore it and we're not going to apply that again. So you can specify, if this thing changes, don't do anything about it. That's what ignore changes are for. That's fairly straightforward. Protect is a really useful one that stops you accidentally deleting resources, or probably most useful, Pulumi accidentally deleting resources. So there have been times in the past, and I'm sure most people have encountered this, where you come to run an update and it shows you what it's going to be done, but you don't spot that it's decided it wants to recreate a resource. For some resources, having the resource recreated is not really a big deal. But if you've got data in those resources, so let's say it's a storage account, or if it's a AKS, a Kubernetes cluster that's got containers running within it. If you recreate that cluster or you recreate that storage account, everything that was running within it or the data in it is going to be deleted. But Pulumi doesn't know anything about that, so it doesn't care. So if you've got important resources like that would be a big deal if they got recreated, then you can add this protect flag, and that will stop that doing it. It will give you an error when you try and run the deployment saying you're trying to recreate this storage account and you're not allowed. Similarly, if you try and delete things, you actually run a Pulumi destroy, it will prevent that as well. And if you remember from the previous video, if you actually do want to destroy something, what you would have to do is go ahead and delete this protect equals true, run a Pulumi up to remove it, and then you can run Pulumi destroy. So those are two we've used already, but there's a few more as well. So we'll start at the top of the list. So the first one, additional secret outputs. And so this is a really useful one if you are creating resources that have sensitive data that gets stored in the state file. And for some reason, Pulumi hasn't already picked that as a secret. So a lot of the times when a resource is created, particularly if you're passing in secrets to a resource, Pulumi will pass that through and they will end up encrypted at the other end as well. But if you really wanted to make sure something was protected, or you've got some other data that hasn't been identified as a secret and you want to encrypt it, you could add this additional secret output and you could have that encrypted in the state file. So we could do location. We could tell it the location is an additional secret output. It's not, but it doesn't matter, and it would encrypt that. Now, that doesn't have any impact on the way the rest of it works, because Pulumi can obviously decrypt that. It's just if somebody gets hold of your state file. So you can put whatever you want in there and make it a secret, and that will get encrypted in your state file. And that's obviously a list, so we could also do tags and encrypt those as well if we wanted to. You can use that if you know something is a secret, or you want to make something a secret and it's not encrypted currently. So next up, we've got aliases. Most of the time you won't use this, but sometimes you might find that actually the name you've given the resource in the Pulumi state file, so in this case, this is the resource group here, isn't what you want it to be. You actually want to change that. So let's say we wanted to change resource group to RG. If I ran that now, that would go ahead and delete the resource group and everything in it, and then recreate it, which is not what you want. Just for changing the name in the state file, which has nothing to do with the actual resource being deployed. So instead, what we could do is we could say we'll call that, and then we will create an alias called resource group. So this will mean that if I deploy any new versions of this, then the resource group will get created with the RG name, and that's fine. But any existing deployments that have the old resource group name will still work. It will see that it's an alias, and it will use that just fine. It won't cause any problems. Custom timeouts is not something I've ever really had to use, but this allows you to specify a different timeout to what is under the hood. So if you're using Azure, most of the timeouts will be coming from the ARM API. But you can tell Pulumi, actually, I want this timeout to be longer than what it should, what the default is. That's custom timeouts will allow you to do that. Delete before replace, and this is a boolean, so you can set this to true. Pulumi tries to be clever, and if you are going to recreate a resource, so it needs to delete and then recreate a resource. By default, what it will do is it will try and create the new resource before deleting the old resource. Now, this only works if you use the ability of Pulumi to auto-generate the name of the resource, so the actual Azure name, so this resource group name. If we didn't specify this, Pulumi would generate one for us, and it would have a random number in it. And so if it then went to recreate it, it would create the new one with a slightly different name in Azure before it deleted the old one. Now, the vast majority of the time, I don't use that ability because I will need to name my stuff to match what it needs to be specified by me. And therefore, if I tried to recreate a resource, it would probably fail if I didn't have this delete before replace, because it would try and create the new resource with the same name as the existing one. That would fail and it wouldn't go anywhere. So this is quite a common one to set if you are if you're setting your own names. So next up, we've got deleted with. And so what this allows us to do is specify a list of other resources that if those resources get deleted, then this resource will actually get deleted as well. So this allows you to kind of imply a dependency without directly there being any relationship between them, but they are sort of their life cycle is together. So if you delete the main one, this will get deleted alongside it. Depends on allows you to define an explicit dependency relationship with another resource. So a lot of the time when we're creating Pulumi resources, we're creating implicit dependencies by saying, the name of this resource comes from the output of this resource or whatever. And that creates a lot of implicit dependencies. And a lot of the time that is more than enough. But if you explicitly need to define this resource depends on this resource, either to make it clear, or sometimes there is a dependency, but you're not able to define it implicitly, then you can use this depends on to define a list of resources that you are dependent on. Import we used previously in the video when we looked at import. So here I can specify an ID of the resource in Azure. This is an example of an existing resource if I want to be able to import it. Check out the import video if you want more details on that. Parent allows us to specify another resource as the parent of this resource. And mainly that's just about sort of the display piece. When you run the Pulumi up UI, it will show them as a graph. It will show, you've got this resource that then has resources under it. So what we might want to do, we wouldn't do it with the resource group, but what we might want to say here is actually that the parent of that's the storage account is the resource group. Or something like that. And that would allow us to then see when you do the deployment in the Pulumi console, it will show a sort of dependency, a parent-child relationship on that. Next up, we've got provider and providers, and we've used these previously. This allows you to specify which provider it uses to connect to your cloud provider or so on. So remember, we used this further down here where we said we wanted to deploy to a different subscription. So we created a second sub provider, and then in the storage account, we indicated it should use that provider, basically allowing you to specify different providers from the default if you want certain resources to be deployed to different subscriptions, or if you need to manually just create a provider. If we look at something like AKS, if we want to connect to AKS through Kubernetes, we have to create a Kubernetes provider that has the credentials in it, and then we want to use that. We will specify that in this provider option. Provider lets you specify one. Providers lets you specify multiple if an object can accept that. Replace on changes allows you to force replacement when a certain property of the resource changes. So if you've got a property that normally would just get changed if you changed it, it would change it on the existing resource. You can actually force it to say, if this changes, delete and recreate it. So you just put in here, you put in location, and if the location changed it, it would then recreate the resource. Probably a bad example because it would do that with the location anyway, but some other resources, though, let's say if you change any of the tags, then it will get recreated, which is probably not what you want in that scenario, but that's something you could do if you wanted to. Next up, we've got retain on delete, which allows you to make sure a resource is kept even if you run Pulumi destroy. So what will happen here is if you specify retain on delete for a resource, so you set that to true, it will then ensure that if you run the Pulumi delete command, it will delete everything else that's not set to retain. But for this object, it will delete it from the state file. It will no longer be part of what Pulumi is looking at, but it will be left in the cloud provider. So you won't actually delete it in Azure. It'll be orphaned from Pulumi as far as it's concerned, but it will still exist within Azure, so that you can use it if you wish to. Transformations is a really interesting one that we'll probably have a dedicated video to at some point because it's quite complex. But transformations allow you basically to apply transformations and changes to a resource's properties before it gets deployed that are separate to the resource itself. So this could be used, for example, to force the protect equals true property onto all your resources. Or to give you probably a more useful example, one area where I've used it quite extensively is Helm charts. So this is for Kubernetes. It's a bit separate to Azure. If you've not used Helm charts, then they're basically sort of a zip file of YAML files that get applied to Kubernetes to deploy a resource. And oftentimes you get these Helm charts from third parties, so they figure out how you deploy their resources. And so they're configured by that third party. And oftentimes there is the ability to pass properties into Helm charts to be able to set certain things. But if the third party doesn't specify a certain property that you're allowed to change, you're a little bit stuck. But this is where you can use transformations. A Helm chart, when it's deployed by Pulumi, there are two ways to deploy it. The way that it works with transformations is effectively it decompiles the Helm chart into lots of different YAML files and then deploys the YAML files. And so what you can have a transformation for is to basically say to Pulumi, once you've got those YAML files, look for any resources in those YAML files with a certain type. So in the case of, let's say, a pod in Kubernetes, and apologies if you're not deep into Kubernetes, but a pod is a container. But you can basically say, if there are any resources of that type, go and change this setting to be something else. I can't directly pass that into the Helm chart in the normal way, but I can basically inject this in part of the Pulumi's processing to say, once you've got these resources ready to go and change this value to something else. And so it can be quite useful if you need to do that. A lot of the times you will never use this, you won't touch this because the defaults are all fine. But transformations do allow you to be a bit more powerful around how the resource gets deployed. So we'll do a video on those at some point in the future if you're interested. But for now, just be aware that it exists, and it can be really useful if you've got no other way of dealing with a certain property you need to apply. And then the last one is version, and this allows you to specify the version of the provider that you're using for this, or the plugin. So the Azure native provider or whatever. So you can tell it actually use an older version of the provider. Don't use the latest. Most of the time you're not going to need to do that, but you can use the version property for that. And so that's it for this video. It's a bit of a short one, but just hopefully gives you an idea of what you could achieve with the resource options. So if you're trying to do something and the defaults aren't doing what you want, or you want to set some particular ways it's deployed, then there might be a resource option that will help you. I certainly recommend being aware that things like protection things like delete before replace, those sort of things, and those ignore changes will probably come in useful when you get to hit a point and you're suddenly finding every time I deploy something, it's getting a change, and it really isn't a change. At some point, most people do hit that, and the ignore changes can help with that. So yeah, some useful tools in your tool bag that will help hopefully with your deployments when you get a bit beyond what the defaults provide. That's it for this week. Hope that was useful, and hopefully I will see you next time.